You ever have one of those mornings where you just pull out of your driveway and suddenly, bam, you realize you can't get out because someone, or in my case the HOA, decided you weren't allowed to leave your own house? I wish I were exaggerating, but no, that's exactly how it started. I lived in this quiet little neighborhood in Crestwood Hills, the kind of place where everyone knows your business but pretends they don't, and honestly, I loved it most of the time. But apparently, the HOA had a different idea about what quiet and controlled meant. One Saturday morning, I walked out to my car, coffee in hand, ready for a lazy drive to the grocery store, and the first thing I noticed was a big, ugly sign stuck right in front of my driveway, along with some cones and a barricade that looked like it had been built to keep the world out. At first, I thought, okay, maybe it's some construction or a utility thing. But then I saw the little note stapled to the sign: driveway blocked due to violation of HOA regulations. And I blinked. I read it twice. My brain refused to process it, because apparently, I had violated some rule I'd never heard of. And the kicker? I wasn't just blocked temporarily. They had literally made it impossible for me to drive out. I went back inside, trying to calm myself, because my first instinct was to scream, bang on doors, maybe start a war. I sat on the couch, staring at the barricade through the window, and thought about what I'd done wrong. I checked the HOA emails, the newsletters, the stupid little amendments that nobody reads. Nothing. Absolutely nothing said I couldn't park a car there or leave my house. So it was deliberate. Someone had made a decision to control me, to inconvenience me, just because they could. And at that moment, I felt that weird mix of disbelief and rage that you only get when someone challenges your basic freedom to get into your car. I thought about calling the HOA, but honestly, I'd done it before over other stupid little issues, and it always ended the same way. Long hold times, passive-aggressive emails, and the sense that they were smugly in control. So I did what any reasonable person might do after being trapped in their own home by an organization that thinks it rules the world. I sat and fumed. I paced around the kitchen, yelling at my coffee mug, imagining what it would be like to just drive through the cones and risk a $500 fine, maybe get called before some HOA committee, have a little passive-aggressive meeting, maybe even be shamed in front of my neighbors. And the more I thought about it, the more absurd it got. I mean, seriously, my driveway, my car, and they were standing there, trying to assert power like I was some teenager who couldn't park straight. By Monday, I'd had enough. I called the HOA office, tried to speak calmly, and was met with a secretary who basically told me to follow the rules or don't leave your house. That was it. No explanation, no discussion, just a flat, bureaucratic wall that made me realize I wasn't dealing with humans. I was dealing with an institution that thrived on control. That's when I knew, if I wanted to leave my house without being bullied, I had to play their game, but on my terms. And the first step? Blocking the only road they used to leave the neighborhood. I know it sounds petty, and maybe it is, but hear me out. I drove around, observed the traffic patterns, counted the entrances, and realized there was literally only one road out that everyone, including HOA board members, used daily. If I wanted to make a point, and maybe get a little poetic justice, I could do it without breaking any laws, just by using my car as a barricade strategically, in plain sight, where there were no rules saying I couldn't park there. That night, I planned it like a little heist. I visualized where I'd place the vehicle, how I'd angle it to completely block the street without hitting any fire hydrants or violating city code, and I even imagined the looks on the board. Members' faces when they discovered they couldn't leave for their Monday morning meeting. So Monday morning came, and I woke up with a mix of excitement and dread because today was D-Day in my little neighborhood drama. I grabbed my coffee, slid into my truck, and drove slowly toward the road I had scouted the night before. Everything looked normal at first, birds chirping, neighbors heading out for work, but then I spotted a few familiar SUVs in the distance, glinting like little orange flags of doom. The HOA board was heading out for their weekly meeting, unaware that their path would soon be completely blocked. I parked my truck with precision, taking care to leave room for pedestrians and emergency access, but otherwise, the road was mine. My heart was racing, adrenaline pumping, because I knew exactly what was about to happen, and it felt strangely cinematic, like I was the lead in some dark comedy about suburban warfare. It started slowly. At first, people didn't notice. I sat in the truck, pretending to scroll on my phone, watching shadows stretch across the asphalt. And then it happened. Mr. Patterson, the president of the HOA, pulled up in his black SUV, the one he always used to look important, and slammed on the brakes. He got out, hands on hips, squinting at me like I had just grown another house on the street overnight. "What the hell is this?" he shouted, voice dripping with disbelief and anger. I rolled down my window, hands casually resting on the steering wheel, and said, "Good morning. You might want to find another way out today." His face went red, and I could see the gears turning as he processed that he literally could not move. The rest of the board started piling out of their cars, all muttering, pointing, and trying to make sense of the fact that the only road they used every week had been taken over by one guy's truck. They tried reasoning, of course. "This is unacceptable. You can't just..." Mr. Patterson started, waving his arms, trying to assert control. But I just smiled, leaned back, and said, "Actually, I can. Until the HOA sorts out why my driveway was blocked last week, this seems like a fair exchange." There was a pause, a moment where the world felt perfectly still except for the wind in the trees, and then the arguments began. People shouted, neighbors came out to watch, and I had to suppress a laugh because it was exactly the chaos I had imagined, amplified tenfold. And yet, under the comedy, there was tension. If I miscalculated even a little, someone could get hurt, or a call to the cops could turn everything into a legal nightmare. So I stayed calm, calculating every angle, every potential move, watching faces, gauging reactions like some kind of strategist. Of course, they tried to bully me. "Move your truck right now. This is harassment," one of them yelled. "You're obstructing traffic." I nodded thoughtfully, like I was considering their point, and said, "Funny, I remember you blocking my driveway last week. Let's call it even until we figure this out." That seemed to infuriate them even more because it framed the entire standoff as a balance of power. Every board member had a different reaction. Some fumed silently, glaring daggers at me. Others started pacing, muttering about rules and fines, and one older woman actually pulled out her phone and began taking photos. I realized then that this wasn't just about blocking a road. This was about showing that I wouldn't be pushed around, that I could hold my ground while still being perfectly legal. Then came the calls to the police, which I had anticipated. I watched from my truck as a patrol car rolled slowly down the street. Lights off at first, cautious. The officer, a tall guy with a calm demeanor, stepped out and asked both sides to explain. The board started talking over each other, yelling about regulations, violations, unlawful obstruction, and I calmly presented my case. They blocked my driveway without notice. I'm not breaking any laws by parking my vehicle in a public right-of-way. I just want a fair resolution. The officer nodded, asked a few pointed questions, and eventually said he couldn't force me to move, but he suggested a discussion between the parties to resolve it peacefully. That moment felt like victory number one. Not the final victory, but the first acknowledgement that I wasn't the one in the wrong. The standoff lasted hours. I alternated between sipping my coffee, chatting with amused neighbors who had come out to watch, and observing the board members trying to figure out how to deal with the situation. Their frustration was almost palpable. One younger board member tried to intimidate me by leaning over my truck window and yelling, but I stayed calm, smiling politely, letting the absurdity of the moment do the work for me. Every shout, every glare, every futile threat only reinforced my sense of control. I had turned a situation that was initially frustrating and unfair into a spectacle that exposed their mismanagement and hypocrisy. By mid-afternoon, negotiations began in earnest. I agreed to unblock the road if they removed the barricade from my driveway and issued a written apology for the inconvenience. The discussion was tense, voices raised, hands gesturing wildly, and every now and then, a neighbor would mutter a snide comment that made the board flinch. And slowly, inch by inch, the barricade in front of my driveway was taken down. I backed my truck up slightly to allow access, but I kept enough presence to signal that I wasn't done asserting my boundaries. And finally, after hours of negotiation, the road was clear, the driveway was open, and the board had learned, if not humility, at least caution. That night, I sat on my porch with a beer, looking down the street, reflecting on the day. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving behind a mixture of relief and disbelief. I thought about the absurdity of it all. A simple suburban neighborhood, a driveway, a few cars, and yet it had escalated into a full-blown standoff that felt like a war movie. I laughed quietly, shaking my head, because if someone had told me a year ago that I would spend a morning blocking my neighbor's only exit just to reclaim my driveway, I wouldn't have believed it. And yet, there I was, exhausted but satisfied, knowing that I had stood my ground without resorting to threats, violence, or illegal actions. I had turned a frustrating encounter into a lesson in strategy, patience, and the power of calculated action. And even though the standoff was over, I realized that the neighborhood dynamic had shifted. The board no longer assumed they could push me around. I had demonstrated that I understood the rules, knew my rights, and was willing to enforce them creatively if necessary. There was a quiet respect now, a kind of wary acknowledgement that the next time someone tried to block me, they might think twice. And as I sipped my beer, listening to the wind rustle the trees and the occasional car drive by peacefully, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks: control. Not over anyone else, but over my own space, my own decisions, and my own peace of mind. After the dust settled, the neighborhood felt different. Not in a bad way, just quieter, like everyone had collectively exhaled and realized the absurdity of the whole ordeal. I drove slowly down my street the next morning, noting how the sunlight hit the freshly cleared road, how the shadows stretched across the asphalt, and I couldn't help but feel a little smug. The barricade in front of my driveway was gone, the road fully passable, and yet I knew the message had been sent. I had stood my ground, and people understood that pushing me around wasn't going to be as easy as they thought. I spent the day walking around, chatting with neighbors, and I could tell a few of them were quietly impressed. Some even admitted to me later that they'd never seen anyone handle an HOA confrontation with such creativity. I laughed when I heard that, because it was ridiculous. I mean, blocking someone's only exit? That's classic, almost cartoonish revenge, but it worked. And it worked without me doing anything illegal, without yelling, without throwing a tantrum. The whole situation was a reminder that sometimes the best way to win isn't through anger. It's through calculated action and patience. I thought a lot about the board, especially Mr. Patterson. I imagined him pacing his living room, muttering about rules and bylaws, thinking about how I had outmaneuvered him. It felt satisfying, sure, but it also made me reflect on human behavior in general. People who seek control often underestimate the ones they perceive as less informed or less powerful. That's not just HOA drama, it's life. And when you stand your ground with calm determination, when you know your rights and execute a plan thoughtfully, people notice, and suddenly the dynamics change. I had never thought I'd gain such a clear lesson about negotiation, psychology, and patience from a blocked driveway, but here we are. Over the next few weeks, the neighborhood returned to normal, or as normal as Crestwood Hills could ever be. I made a point to leave my truck parked legally, unobtrusively, but just enough that everyone remembered my little stunt. Every now and then, I'd see a board member glance my way, subtly acknowledging that things weren't going to go back to the way they were. And honestly, I liked that quiet respect, the understanding that I had demonstrated initiative and resolve without creating chaos or breaking the law. I even started thinking about the absurdity and humor of the whole thing. Imagine someone telling this story in a few years. Yeah, the HOA blocked my driveway, so I blocked the only road they could leave. People would laugh, incredulous, because it was petty in a charming way, clever in a suburban war kind of way, and entirely satisfying. And yet, it wasn't just about petty revenge. It was about boundaries, about knowing when to escalate, about thinking strategically rather than emotionally, and about using the rules, and sometimes the quirks of your environment, to your advantage. One evening, I was sitting on my porch with a beer, watching the sunset over the street, and it hit me that this story had layers I hadn't appreciated before. On one level, it was pure humor and catharsis. On another level, it was about human psychology, asserting oneself, the perception of power, how people react when their control is challenged. And then there's the social lesson. Communities like this are fragile. They rely on mutual respect, understanding, and a little common sense. When those things break down, even small acts, like blocking a road, can teach lessons that stick far longer than a stern email or a polite phone call ever would. Of course, life doesn't come with perfect endings. I still had to be vigilant, still had to maintain good relationships with the neighbors who weren't part of the HOA board, and I knew that the board could still attempt something in the future. But I also knew I had the tools, the mindset, and the confidence to handle it if they tried. The incident had shifted my perspective. I felt more capable, more aware of my rights, and more attuned to the subtleties of human behavior. I had experienced firsthand how people react when their assumptions are challenged, and I had learned to stay calm, think strategically, and act decisively. And now, even months later, I sometimes walk down the street, past my driveway, past the empty road, and I let myself imagine what would happen if someone tried it again. I can picture the initial shock, the futile attempts to maneuver around my clever little block, the inevitable frustration as they realize they can't get through, and I can't help but chuckle. Not out of malice, but because it was satisfying in a way that went beyond mere revenge. It was a lesson executed perfectly, a balance restored. Here's the thing, though. I'm sharing this not just because it's funny or outrageous. I'm sharing it because maybe someone else out there has dealt with an unreasonable HOA, a controlling neighbor, or any situation where they felt trapped and powerless. And I want people to see that there's a way to assert yourself thoughtfully and creatively, that you don't have to yell, fight, or break the law to make a point, and that sometimes patience, observation, and a little ingenuity go a long way. It's about strategy, about understanding the system, and about knowing yourself enough to act in a way that is calm, deliberate, and ultimately satisfying. So here's my final thought. The driveway is mine. The road is clear. The HOA learned their lesson, or at least they learned caution, and I sit here knowing I handled the situation on my terms. But I'll leave it with a question for anyone watching. If you were in my shoes, would you have acted the same way? Would you have waited for the HOA to fix the situation, or would you have done something bold, maybe a little petty, maybe a little creative, to assert your rights? I want to hear your opinions. Drop a comment, share a story if you've had your own HOA or neighbor nightmare, and tell me what you would do differently, or the same. Because that's the beauty of these stories. They're not just entertainment, they're a chance for all of us to think about how we handle conflict, boundaries, and a little bit of suburban chaos. And that's how a block driveway turned into a lesson in patience, strategy, human behavior, and, yes, a little mischief. The street is quiet now. The sun sets over the road that was once mine and theirs, and I sit back, sipping my drink, smiling at the absurdity and satisfaction of it all. Life is strange. The lessons come from unexpected places, and sometimes the smallest acts, like parking your truck in the perfect spot, can teach people more than 1,000 emails ever could.